Hey girls, it's Miss Cartwright here. Today we're going to watch a quick video to learn about how to use literary criticism in our own writing. Please note that all of this information is adapted from LitWeb, the Norton Introduction to Literature Study Space. So let's get started. The first thing to know today are our outcomes. By the end of this instruction, you want to know how to use sources, when to use a quote, how to cite a quote, how to agree with a secondary source, how to disagree with a secondary source, and also how to use a signal phrase. So moving right along, please always remember that your secondary sources are secondary, and that's true of your primary sources as well. Quotations are tools that you use to deepen and enrich your own argument about the literary text, and they should never substitute for your original argument. You should never simply repeat in your essay or report on what other people have already said. We're writing argumentative essays, so that means you need to be constructing your own argument and then drawing on these other folks for support. In terms of using the secondary sources, we want to use them to show one of two things, either an opinion or a concept. So an opinion is other readers' views and interpretations of the text, the author, or the topic, which then in your essay you would support, criticize, or develop. A concept is a general term or theoretical framework that you want to borrow and apply to your own author or text. In our case, that'll be Great Expectations. Please note that for the purposes of this essay, we're really not interested in background information about the history or biography, so let's avoid using any quotations that are just information about the text or information about Charles Dickens. So once we've found those quotes, we might want to agree with them. So suppose, for example, that you are writing an essay on the poem Daddy by Sylvia Plath. That's actually one that we get to read next semester, later this semester, so you should be excited. Your essay claims that the speaker adopts two voices, that of her child self and that of her adult self, an opinion that is also set forth in Axelrod's article, Jealous Gods. You cannot prove this claim to be true merely by saying that Axelrod makes the same claim. Like any debatable claim, this one must be backed up with evidence from the primary text, so you'll have to use quotes straight from the poem to help you show it. In this situation, however, you must use a secondary source in order to show that the same claim has already been made, and that does three things for you. It gives the source credit for having had that idea or stating that opinion before you did. It encourages the reader, that in this case me, to see you as knowledgeable and trustworthy, and to also know that you've taken the time to explore, digest, and represent others' opinions. And then thirdly, citing that first quote from Axelrod demonstrates that your opinion isn't merely idiosyncratic. It's not just some weird idea you had, because another informed person, even an expert person, agrees with you. When you want to use a secondary source for disagreement, you want to acknowledge and disagree in order to demonstrate that the originality of your own interpretation exists, while also encouraging the reader to see you as knowledgeable, careful, and trustworthy writer. It doesn't make your opinion less valid if you disagree with the secondary source. It just means that you have to do a stronger job of proving that it's true with that primary source material that you find. The third thing that you want to know about using a secondary source is that whenever you include one in your own writing, whether that be through paraphrase or through direct quotation, you want to use something that's called a signal phrase. You guys know that a signal is something that draws your attention. It tells you what to do. And a signal phrase does the same thing. So whenever you introduce or follow a quotation from a source, you use that signal phrase to introduce the author's name. And you might also want to include the author's title, a bit of information about his or her status, and then, as you always do when you use a quotation, you include the context, so a tiny bit about his article. Here's an example. In his study of the Frankenstein myth, Chris Baldick claims that, and then we have the quotation, followed by the citation. Notice that the citation is directly following the quotation. And then he applies that secondary source quote, a claim that definitely applies to the Hamlet myth. So here, we're using that quotation to establish a framework. That's a concept quotation. Here's a second example. Oyen Ogungba, himself a scholar of Yoruban descent, suggests that many of Soyinka's plays attempt to capture the mood and rhythm of Yoruban festivals. And there's our citation. So you can see that this signal phrase is introducing a paraphrase. That's something that I want to encourage you to do, because when you're using a quote, you only want to do so if it's so insightful or so intricate that you need to analyze the words of the quote itself. If it's just an idea that you want to represent as coming from somebody else, then use that paraphrase tool. Here's our third quotation. As historian R.K. Webb observes, Britain is a country in miniature. So again, we have that nice signal phrase, and here's an example of a quotation, Britain is a country in miniature, where you really want to capture the language that the original author used. So the final thing I want to show you today is a professional example of using these quotations really succinctly. So this article called We All Said by Lawrence R. Rogers is about the short story A Rose for Emily, which you guys may be familiar with. But what I really want you to pay attention to when we take a look at this article is how Rogers is introducing and integrating his evidence. So here we go. The way of interpreting Emily's decisions to murder Homer are numerous. For simple clarification, they can be summarized along 2 lines. So take a look right here. Rogers tells us that he's going to be summarizing, 2 different groups of secondary sources, 2 different ideas about Emily's decision to murder Homer. So he gives us his first group here. One group finds that the murder growing out of Emily's demented attempt to foresaw the inevitable passage of time towards her abandonment by Homer, towards her own death, and towards the steady encroachment of the North and the New South on something loosely defined as the tradition of the Old South. So that's the summary of that first critical perspective, that first group of secondary sources. Another view, here he goes introducing it, sees the murder in more psychological terms. It grows out of Emily's complex relationship to her father, who, by elevating her above all the eligible men of Jefferson, ensured that to yield what one commentator called normal emotions associated with desire, his daughter had to retreat into a marginal world, into fantasy. So there we have our first 2 ideas. And now we get to Rogers' own ideas. These lines of interpretation complement more than critique each other. Together, they de-emphasize the element of detection, viewing the murder and its solution not as the central action, but as manifestations of the principal event, the decline of the Grierson lineage, and all it represents. Recognizing the way in the story makes use of the detective genre, however, adds an interpretive layer to the story by making the narrator a central player in the pattern of deception. So what Rogers has done here is discuss these and summarize these 2 critical perspectives in order to show that his own interpretation is an entirely new one. So he's contextualized his own view of the events in A Rose for Emily. All right, you guys, at this point you should be familiar with when to use a quote from a secondary source, how to cite it, how to agree with it, how to disagree with it, and then also how to use a signal phrase to introduce it in your own writing. Please remember, one last thought, that the longer the quote is in your own essay, the more analysis and the more commentary I'll expect to see following it. So really just use the small bits and pieces of the quotation that you need to use to support your own idea. Thanks so much, girls.